I call the member for Bowman.
Deputy Speaker, the changes that we debate and discuss today to the Higher Education Support Act really exemplify what has been a Labor government confused and interfering in higher education policy. And the previous Speaker, the member for Fraser, makes a florid attempt to disguise this as evidence-based policy, when in fact it represents little more than a backflip and a sellout to the many maths, science and statistics students who undertook their courses trusting the government of the day. Deputy Speaker, we have agreed that there are areas of national workforce priority, nursing, education among them, and for a time there, and certainly since 2008, this current Labor government extended a discount help fee, not $7,500 per unit, but closer to $4,000 for those in the sciences, statistics, and the physical, essentially the physical sciences. And this was an important and universally welcomed piece of policy from the then Labor government and the previous Prime Minister. Today is not an attack on what is being brought before this House, nor any effort to suggest that we'll vote against the bill. What I do think needs to be pointed out in this chamber is what has been a constant policy interference. That's right, a constant annoyance for the tertiary education sector by a government that simply can't make up its mind. Now, it is one thing to make the case, as Bruce Chapman has done, the expert in income contingent loans, and has done some great work out of ANU. It's one thing to say that the demand elasticity round study simply doesn't support the evidence that reducing the price to study actually gets more people doing it. But the evidence, in fact, is otherwise. We know that from as early as 2009, after those changes the previous year, that there was both an increase in applications and enrolments. We know that in the first year it increased by 13%, in the second year in 2010 it increased by 9%. That is applications alone. And when we look at enrolments, a similar story, up 13 and 12% against 9 and 6 for the rest of the tertiary education sector. Now that's a significant influx of new people, which we can only put down to, when you're comparing it against the rest of the student cohort, the intervention that was reducing the price to study in those very areas. Now it's up to this government then, faced with that information, that data that extended right through to 2012, where the highest increase in enrolments was 10% in the physical sciences. So clearly we were on the path to fixing a problem. So I think if the government suddenly wants to change tack and not grandfather any students whatsoever, and say that as of next year, once again, all the rules are changing. And doesn't this sound familiar in other areas of this government's conduct? That's right, all the rules are changing, whether you're halfway through a degree, close to completion, or just finished your first year, up go these fees per unit to $8,500. That's right, if you're studying math and science or statistics, that in some way you are now less needy than those doing nursing or education. And the fact that there was no grandfathering indicates a level of fiscal panic to which we've become familiar. And secondly, an inability to roll out parallel and concurrent and more effective measures. No, simply chopping away what they promised to do in 2008, chopping that away, and then promising that there's a whole host, yes, that's right, as the member for Fraser said, a whole swathe of new measures that are likely to be more evidence-based and even more effective. But that's nothing more than an idle promise. No, we're leaving entire cohorts stranded and now paying double, stranded and not having the promise that a government made fulfilled to them. Now, from the Grattan Institute, Andrew Norton referred to this constant introduction and withdrawals of incentive measures. And you can understand that there's this almost form of tertiary education sovereign risk, which is that students today simply cannot trust their government to make one decision and stick to it through the period that they do their study. They cannot. And that's what's so completely clear today. The savings, around $315 million over the forward estimates, are not insignificant. But let's remember who's paying that. These are students in maths, science and statistics, the very people who responded to that government's call in 2008 and the previous Prime Minister, for whom many elevated for those great words about rescuing science, about allowing for the growth of CSIRO, recentralising the role of that group in the nation's psyche and providing for their needs. Well, that's all been thrown out in the rush for a surplus. That's all been thrown out in the rush for a petty political promise. And it comes directly from the pockets of these students. That's right, plenty of areas where one could have saved, and all the memories of waste are now you're sort of rolling through those who are listening to this debate. But no, they've hit up the students of science. and of maths, our future maths and science teachers in secondary schools, where around the country we see these campuses holding out their arms looking for new graduates to take up the challenge. We talk about $150,000 being a large price to pay. But what is the price to pay for a high school that can't get a great maths teacher to inspire the next generation? Deputy Speaker, we've had this debate and we've agreed that this is an incredibly important area for Australia's future. Our maths and science students, our enrollees who become graduates, and then teachers of the next generation. Now, nothing's changed between 2008 and now. All that's changed is that this intervention delivered us more graduates, more people willing to take on this really important area, this very important intellectual pursuit, only to have it ripped away from them in a MyEFO last year, only to be done for no other reason but to meet this government's grubby attempt to fulfil their political promise of a surplus. That's right. So while we are not going to oppose this bill, and we recognise that in a time of fiscal pressures that we do have to support certain elements of savings, let no one forget, listening to this debate or reading it in the years ahead, that this government, the Labor government, the self-professed friends of the student, actually reached into the pockets of science, statistics and maths students and made them pay twice as much per unit because they had to find some way to deliver the surplus that they promised 2 or 3 years ago. Let's remember when the options appraisal time came that we have an Education Minister on this side of the chamber in the government, Deputy Speaker, who chose to hit the most vulnerable, but also potentially the most valuable graduates that we can ask for after nursing and education. And let's never forget all the future scientists, that it was this government that embarked on a 2 or 3 year sensible policy of attracting more students into the field, only, as I've said, to rip the carpet out from under them in 2012. Deputy Speaker, we have a certain number of changes that people can expect are inevitable, but there is no need to be enforcing this on thousands of students around the country that believed and trusted the government. There was plenty of option to grandfather those, which this government has chosen not to do. There were plenty of options to roll out concurrent measures, which might have been potentially more effective or more targeted. But no, the government elected not to do that too. This was a late night drawing lines through programs to desperately find a way to achieve a surplus, because for 3 years of ill discipline, Deputy Speaker, 3 years of spending money where it didn't need to be spent, now this government finds itself with the cupboard bare. They find themselves in the pickle that they can't meet a political promise, and these are the victims that we are seeing today. What we do know, Deputy Speaker, is that people responded to this initiative. I accept that the Bradley Review found that the money could have been targeted in better ways to achieve similar outcomes. But that's cold comfort once you've started studying, isn't it? Once you've enrolled for a science or a maths course, you're halfway through it, you've budgeted to get your way through your degree, you've found a way to do the work part-time to get yourself through, only to be hit by a doubling of fees, which effectively is achieved by this government's return to Band 2 charging, which means over $8,500 per course. That kind of change, that kind of shock to a student shouldn't be underestimated. Many of them don't have the luxury, Deputy Speaker, of switching from one course to another. Many of them are too far through their degrees to be able to do that in an efficient way. They made a commitment, Deputy Speaker, to this nation to refill the lines that are needed to assist and to recharge the forces that we need in schools, in TAFEs and in universities around the country to re-energise. That's right, to re-energise the teaching of maths and sciences. We identified this as a priority a decade ago. It's not inappropriate to use the help system to achieve those outcomes. The evidence that the government doesn't fully support what it's even proposing today is that the discounts will remain for other fields of study. So the question we all should be asking is, what's so different about studying the maths and sciences? What is the government proposing to do if their new changes are not as effective? The figures that we've presented today are not insignificant. They were significant increases. To have the physical sciences at 10% this year as the fastest growing area of enrolments, clearly something was working well. So in closing, we have a government that is inconsistent. We have a government that is penny pinching and nickel and diming some of the most vulnerable who are studying as undergraduates at present. We have exemplified today a form of sovereign risk where you can't trust the government that they're not going to twiddle the knobs again next year in some shape or form. It's a government that doesn't respect that when you make a promise to a student there's some chance that that promise will be stuck to at least through the period of your undergraduate study. And lastly, we have a government that's using the evidence available to them through the Bradley Review where it suits them, for their fiscal benefit, but not necessarily for the long-term needs of Australia. For those out there who are concerned that maths and science won't be adequately staffed by inspired and educated Australians of the future, they should be looking at this legislation. It will be remembered in history as an opportunity this government had to, despite a bit of political pain, to support that cohort. That support has been removed. They've saved a few $100 million in the process, and we hope that the measures they've put in place in return will be just as effective to make sure that we continue to see spirited growth for those in the physical sciences, because we are nowhere near fixing the problem. Deputy Speaker, these 10% increases over the last 3 years are simply not enough. We will need much more than that, and this opposition will be watching closely to see the government measures are effective and that it isn't a simple form of penny pinching to meet their commitment to a political surplus in the year 2012-13.